Joy, many years ago, you gave me a picture with a poem by Mary Oliver. And so I thought that would be our opening reading this morning. It just made so much sense to me because I look at it every morning and think, thank you, Joy. So this is at Blackwater Pond. At Blackwater Pond, the tossed waters have settled after a night of rain. I dip my cupped hands. I drink a long time. It tastes like stone, leaves, fire. It falls cold into my body, waking the bones. I hear them deep inside me, whispering, oh, what is that beautiful thing that just happened? And a beautiful thing this morning is that you're here.
Thank you, Libby. So I just dive in, it sounds like. That's a beautiful poem. I haven't heard that in a long time. Thank you for that.
Record.
Oh, I do see the record button on, so that's great. So I, probably everyone who's spoken has said this, but I'm so grateful for the exercise in doing this because it's a real like spiritual journey just to try and capture one's life and what mattered. So I'm really appreciative of this. So I've listened to a few of yours and I thought I would just dive in with some roots about my parents and then how I came on the scene. And let me just double check here. I think as long as you can hear me okay, I think my earphones were telling me something funny, but as long as you guys can hear me, that's good. Okay. It's telling me one's going to go out, but that's all right. So I'll start with my parents. They were both second generation immigrants that were born in New England. My dad in the Berkshires and my mom in Hartford. My maternal grandmother came through Ellis Island from England in 1906 as a child. And my grandfather on my mother's side, who I never met, is from Quebec. My father's side is primarily Irish, 3/4 Irish, mostly Irish potato famine roots. My dad was born at home in South Lee, Massachusetts, in a house that his mother was born in and died in, and is still owned by a cousin. My grandfather, so my dad's dad, ran the general store, which was about a 1/4 mile down the street. And so I have some wonderful childhood memories of going to visit the store and getting licorice and in particular Nestle's Crunch Bars, which always bring back fond memories of my grandfather. My dad early on swore that he would never have a job where you worked 6.5 days a week, 12 plus hours a day. He was a studious kid. He graduated from high school at 16, having spent a few of the years in a one-room schoolhouse. And though he was studious, there wasn't any family money. So he started working at the local paper mill. College just didn't feel like an option. He had an early, I think it was his first supervisor at the paper mill, who took an interest in him and arranged for him to get a work-study scholarship at a military college in Vermont, Norwich College, which of course changed my dad's life. My mom was from Hartford and had a bipolar mother and grandfather. And I think probably that's how they ended up emigrating to the US from a poor industrial area of England. My grandfather, I think, probably had a manic episode, came over, and then my grandmother and all of her, I think, 6 children came, including my grandmother. My great-grandmother came over with my grandmother. My mom spent 4 impressionable years from age 6 to 10 in foster care during the Depression because her mom, my grandmother in her own manic episode, ran off with another man. And mom's French-Canadian father, who was an optometrist, didn't really know what to do with 4 children, so put them in foster care with a French-Canadian family in Hartford. He then remarried and moved on with another family. My bipolar grandmother came back when my mom was 10, and she had a new husband. And so the 4 children moved back in with their mother, who would have an up and down time of occasionally being suicidal. Her husband was a pharmacist, so she self-medicated with phenobarbital. So it was a really tough childhood for my mom. And she decided she needed to get out. In one of those moments of grace, she read a magazine ad on a bus as she graduated high school about a 2-year, little tiny piece of an ad for a 2-year college in Vermont. And she bravely asked her former stepfather, who was now divorced from my grandmother, if he would pay for her to go, and he agreed. So my parents both met in Vermont, escaping their families, and education was their ticket out. So good grades and college, understandably, became mandatory for me and my siblings. My dad served in Europe in World War II, which was right before he met my mom. He was then part of the post-World War II boom with the GI Bill, went to work for General Electric in their management training program, and climbed their management ladder throughout the 1950s and 60s. Like many GE babies, I was born, I could probably even ask you to unmute yourself and you could guess where I was born. I was born in Schenectady, New York, which I still can't spell because my first move was when I was 6 months old and my dad transferred to another GE location. By the time I got to high school, I had lived in 7 houses and gone to several schools, including a somewhat disastrous stretch of going to 4 different schools from late 7th grade until 9th grade. That's such an awkward time for a girl. And back then, nobody made any effort to really integrate new kids in school. So that was a fearful time for me of really wanting to fit in. That was made worse by my having an older brother who, in his own distress, targeted me for some daily verbal bullying, which lasted until my parents moved again from North Carolina, leaving him behind to finish high school. So it was, a difficult time in my life. I was the 3rd of 7 children. In that way that Catholic families were, that was the norm to have a lot of siblings. I took refuge a lot in my childhood in books, trees, and sports. I kiddingly, but maybe not so kiddingly, say that I was raised by Nancy Drew, Leon Uris, pine trees, and playing kickball with the neighborhood kids. But childhood wasn't all difficult. I think because my own mother had such a chaotic life, she wanted her children's lives to be very organized and normal and everything on schedule. So every holiday was fantastic. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Halloween, birthdays were really special. There was always plenty of food, books,
Thank
clothing.
you very much.
A lot of stress on education. I remember a lot of watching Superman reruns on TV, I Love Lucy episodes. So a lot of that quintessential 50s and 60s childhood upbringing. To be honest, I don't know how my mom did all that. Being one of 7, she had no outside help and did everything, cooking, cleaning, shopping. My dad was kind of a man in a gray flannel suit who went to work every day and came home and after dinner read a newspaper and wasn't really part of the childhood upbringing. For 2 weeks every summer, when there was always a GE plant shutdown, until I was about 10, we spent 1 or 2 weeks at my dad's childhood home in Lee, Massachusetts, or they had a cold water only little tiny cabin on Lake Mackinac, which if you go to Tanglewood, that's on Lake Mackinac. That's also called Stockbridge Bowl. So I have very fond memories of being in this cabin and being at my grandparents' house. It was a real anchor and a place of stability. And to this day is magical when I go back to that town. I have a lot of cousins living there. In those ways that one's childhood sometimes gives a glimpse of the future, one of my memories was being at my grandmother's house with its wooden stairs and putting my siblings all sitting on different steps. And I had a little chalkboard and chalk, and I was the teacher and taught math and spelling to my siblings. And early as a kid, thought I'd be a teacher, but changed my mind once I got to college. I had a lot of freedom as a kid. You know, I was one of 7, and we just had to be home for dinner at 6. I spent a lot of time outdoors, riding my bike, playing in the woods, climbing trees. Sports were encouraged. So for much of my adult life, until my knees said no in my 50s, I was an avid local runner and downhill skier. My mom was a skier at Bristol until well into her 80s. I was raised nominally Catholic and attended Mass each Sunday and was baptized and confirmed. I have a teenage memory. I would have been about 14 when my parents had just moved to Rochester that illustrates these unspoken priorities in the family. In 1968, Swain, the ski resort, was pretty new, and my parents bought a family pass. So what we would do on Sunday mornings is we would all don our ski outfits, including our ski boots. You didn't bother with any extra boots. You put your ski boots on at home. And depending on what time we left the house, we'd catch the 8 o'clock Mass in Mount Morris or the 8:30 Mass in Dansville on our way to Swain. And as any of you good Catholics, raised Catholics would know, you meet your weekly obligation if you last through the Mass through communion. So we would piously wait in line in our ski outfits with a community we didn't know. And instead of going back to our pew after communion, we would go right out the back door of the church. So my lasting memory of these Masses was the clip of Cupco bindings on ski boots as we would go right out the back door of the church and on our way to the ski hill. So sports always mattered more to my parents than religion. For 4 years, when my dad was at a GE plant in North Carolina, I was like grades 4 through 7, the beginning of 8th grade. I did attend a tiny Catholic school, 2 grades to a classroom, which I loved. In hindsight, the reason I think they put us in a private school was it was 1964 to 1968, which was the height of the desegregating the Southern schools. And I think they were trying to shield us from that. I think people were quietly very nervous. So we were living this important part of the civil rights era. But like I think a lot of middle-class white families, we never talked about it. It was never a topic of discussion, which, you know, I very much regret. It would have been a real teachable moment for me as a child. My early Catholicism was quietly important to me and gave me a theology for really holding a lot of this uprootedness. You know, I love the rituals of the rosary and the Stations of the Cross. But in parallel, there was an equally important part of my spiritual life, which was yet unnamed. But I could feel this abiding presence in the forest, in the woods, particularly among pine trees. We lived in Glens Falls in the Adirondacks for some of my childhood, and it's another GE plant town. And I just had this other parallel experience of all will be well. And it gave me a lot of comfort and courage when I felt alone as a child. And I didn't label it like I would now as a spiritual experience. I kept it secret, and I really came back to it about 25 years later, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. My family moved to Rochester when I was in ninth grade, and my dad became president of General Railway Signal Company. He stayed until his retirement 25 years later. So it was a big move for them to leave General Electric. But it gave him and my mom and my younger siblings a real anchor. So for me also, Rochester feels more home to me than anywhere. Although I will say the Adirondack Mountains and lakes from my early childhood feel also like a primal connection. And some of you know I camp there every summer. My little brother helps me set that up. And it's a favorite part of my summer. I skipped my last year of high school and was an exchange student in Germany, and then attended Tufts University in Boston in the early 1970s. Ironically for me, what I found out later is Tufts, my understanding, is the first Universalist college in the United States, founded in 1847. I had no idea until years later when I joined First Unitarian that there I was living in one of the roots of Universalism. At the time when I was in college, Boston was one of many, but a big hotbed for women's rights. And I really thoroughly dove in and embraced that, particularly women having equal rights in the workforce. But I do remember coming home in the summers, really almost berating my mother for not being liberated, that she would be buttering my father's toast in the morning and clearing his plate at dinner. And I would tell her she really needed to free herself and be a liberated woman. So it was a little tough because my mother was very traditional and loved being traditional. I have 4 sisters and I have 2 brothers, but my 4 sisters are also all very traditional. I was the only daughter who did not become a cheerleader and did not join a sorority. And, you know, it was kind of shades of always feeling a little bit in, but a little bit out of my family of origin. By college, religion had become the opiate of the masses. I threw the whole thing out, and I was really all about the rational mind and women having an equal place in society. You know, all these moves of my childhood and changing schools, they were difficult, but when I look back, they gave me a resilience, an ability to change and adapt easily, and to make friends easily, to fit in. So I got to college, I made friends easily. I loved my experience. I loved the learning. I loved the diversity. I loved the campus sit-ins, which were going on then. I loved the dancing till all hours in the morning to the Rolling Stones. I loved the beer. The whole college experience was really wonderful for me. And interestingly, due to the pandemic, there were 4 of us very close, and we've reconnected. We live all over the world, and we meet every month on Zoom, which has been a lot of fun. It's my 45th college reunion this year, which I'm not attending, but we've been talking about it. My original career plan was to become a pension expert. We don't even have pensions anymore. Most of us don't. Was to become a pension expert and to run an independent agency that catered to businesses. I wanted a career where success did not mean moving up the corporate ladder and constantly moving cities, which is what I had experienced growing up. I had majored in economics, and I wanted to use some of that skill. I wasn't married yet, and the notion of trailing spouses didn't exist. So this pension expert seemed like a good strategy because it was lucrative, involved building relationships, required financial savvy. So I'd given up on the idea of becoming a teacher because it felt too stereotypically female. And I wanted something that was different, that really captured what I was experiencing in college. 9 months into my first job when I got out of college, it was in New Jersey. I was a support representative for a pension company. And it was in an agency in New Jersey. I was denied the chance to interview to be a salesperson, which is what you would be to then step into running your own agency. I had more experience at that time than any of the other applicants, which I knew because I was friends with the office manager, and she shared with me the resumes of all the other people who were being interviewed. And of course, it was all men. So I put my feminist hat on. I complained to the home office who had hired me straight out of college. I got no response. And being 1976, there was no legal recourse at the time. So I had been fortunate in how little female discrimination I'd experienced. My dad had always been a big supporter of mine, and I think secretly wanted me to follow more in his footsteps than he did his two sons. Just as an aside, my father, I think due to having 5 daughters, he was on the board of the local Women's Career Center that I know Mary Jones talked about when she spoke. And he eventually got blackballed from a leadership role. They belonged to Oak Hill Country Club. He got blackballed from a leadership role because he kept suggesting that women have equal tea times. So he was he was definitely a supporter of women, especially for his generation. So this New Jersey experience was a setback for me in what had been a pretty privileged life, I later realized. So dimly at age 22 and a half, I realized I wanted to just go home, and home was Rochester. And in some ways, it felt like a defeat because I was going to be like Ayn Rand and change the world. It felt like a defeat, but it was also very comforting. So it really was one of the best decisions I ever made. I worked at Xerox for 5 years. They were 5 terrific years. I sold copiers full-time for 3 years while getting an MBA at RIT. I then did corporate strategy work for Xerox downtown at Xerox Square. In those 2 years, I realized I felt really confined by a job that had regular hours, no fresh air, and a desk all day. So I left that job after 2 years, and I'll get back to my career in a minute, but I want to digress because I think part of why Libby asked me to speak, I think, is because of my unusual life around relationships and sexual orientation. I was a tomboy growing up, but I did my share of dating men in college and when I worked at Xerox. I had not examined my sexual orientation because I did feel occasionally attracted to men. And I assumed, of course, that meant I was straight. The terms GLBT didn't exist at the time. But paralleling my traditional dating, I also had a couple of really intense female friendships. Nothing sexual, but very emotionally intense. And more intense than I suspected was, normal. So I hid this from myself, but also from others, because I very much wanted to fit in, given my nomadic childhood. And so I kept it quiet. And when I was 24, I met a wonderful divorced older man who was 40. He had 2 teenage boys living with him. And I fell in love with Lee. A couple of you on, I know Carol Adler knows him, Ellie Stauffer knows him. I really fell in love with him, and also perhaps like that he was kind of a stable father figure for me. We married 3 years later, and we're together for 20 years. He lives in California now, has been married to his 3rd wife for 20 years, and we continue to be good friends. He and I did not have children together. So my 20s and early 30s were a time of being a step parent. I did a lot of college parents' weekends, working. I worked at Xerox and then Hewlett Packard, and sports. after all these years of moving around, I really had a wonderful safe haven. My religion at the time really took two forms. Sports, I was an avid local runner, competing in 10Ks and ran a marathon. And I was a big downhill skier. There was no black diamond I didn't try in Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, New Mexico. It was a really wonderful part of my life. My other religion at the time was the Rochester Women's Network, which Mary Jones talked about in her talk. I joined when it was brand new in the early 80s and was their youngest board member. I loved the creative thinking of these can-do women. I had a lot of volunteer leadership opportunities with them. And I really felt part of that community for, I think, close to 20 years. And it was really a wonderful gift to me at a very exciting time in the women's movement. But in my mid-30s, I had I guess you'd call it a midlife crisis. By then, I'd worked at Hewlett-Packard for 6 years, and I'd had a field job for all of those years. I don't know, some of you may remember one of the original spreadsheets was called Lotus 123. I was the Lotus 123 expert for Hewlett-Packard for all of New York State and traveled all over teaching even the concept of a spreadsheet to new computer users. I mean, personal computers didn't come out until the early 80s. So it was a very exciting time to be working for a technical company. I taught word processing, I taught database management, but I kept getting slotted into increasingly technical jobs, troubleshooting mini computers and things I really did not enjoy. So I was not happy with work. I was 35, I was regretting not having had children. I had to give up competitive running due to a ski injury. So it was a time of really feeling stuck and without purpose. So I decided to get therapy. And I really took to that like a fish to water. I quit my job a couple of months later at Hewlett-Packard and did volunteer work for 2 years. I did a lot of personal growth workshops. I then retooled in the early 90s at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland, that probably most of you haven't heard of, but that gave me the credentials I needed to do what I then did for about 30 years, work I loved as a facilitator, teacher, consultant to corporations in leadership skills, diversity, and communication skills. As I wrote this, I thought, oh, this sounded like just such a breeze of a transition, but I will say this was super scary and filled with doubt, making a career change. It felt like I was too old at 35, 36, 37. And it was scary to break free of my dad's expectations. He was not happy. I quit a corporate job with no other job. So it was a time of really individuating from my family of origin. In hindsight, it feels like it was grace that I was willing to change so much and take risks and get out of that safe haven. I took up yoga. I got my first dog. I got my first pair of hiking boots, and I returned 25 years later to walking among the pine trees. I felt like I was coming back home to myself. So I even at that time in my late 30s, sheepishly rethought my feelings about religion being the opiate of the masses, and did some church shopping very analytically, and joined First Unitarian when Dick Gilbert was there, and I was 40 years old. So in my new career, my big corporate client was Corning. I was part of an initiative to teach thousands of leaders leadership skills. I loved the work and the community, and for a couple of years, spent up to 2 weeks a month down in Corning, New York. Some of you remember that era for me. And so I'm going to dial back to my earlier comments about my ambivalent my bisexuality, I'll say, because I mentioned earlier I had the secret intensity for some women I'd met along my path. And after a lot of years of dormancy, At age 43, it happened again, and this time with a married female Corning executive. I was horrified and felt some shame, my own internalized homophobia, but also excited. I was wiser by now. This was in the late 90s. I was wiser about what LGBT meant and how much more acceptable it was than 20 years earlier. So I was worried I might be gay. So Lee and I had marital issues along the way. And I think a lot of people think the reason our marriage ended was due to sexual orientation issues, but that really wasn't it. But I did in 1998. It was a really scary thing for me. I left my safe marriage for Diane. It felt like I blew up my life. It was a lot less scary in 1998, but it was hard. A few of my friends disappeared. Family members said they would not come to my parents' Thanksgiving if we were there. 6 months after Diane and I got together, her ex-husband committed suicide after graffitiing her Corning home with gay slurs. It turned out he had been stalking us for a couple of months, and the state police were surprised he had not killed us before he committed suicide. When Diane was debating about even coming out at Corning, especially after her house was graffitied, the head of human resources for all of Corning told her, "Don't be a poster child for gay rights." So it was a long way from my safe haven. That all happened in 1980, 98, 99. But I will say one of the interesting silver linings was how supportive my 70-year-old mother was after her initial shock. I've always wondered if she didn't suspect for years maybe that I was gay, and perhaps was relieved when I blew the doors off. She was the one, my father went along with my mom, but she was the one who very loudly welcomed Diane to extended family gatherings, signaling that she, the matriarch, was taking charge. She called my siblings and nieces who balked at coming to events or tried ignoring us. It was another streak of grace that my mother, who kind of left a lot of us to fend for ourselves growing up, was a huge supporter of mine. And I'll say, and I could really cry at this because it still matters so much to me, that 20 years later, my spouse, Maggie, was by far more of a daughter to my mother than even a daughter-in-law. So my mother's ability to shift, and of course, Maggie being such a loving person, was quite an amazing transformation in my life. So back to 1998, Corning was not a welcoming place. So Diane ended up getting a job at Kodak, and we bought a house together in Rochester. Our relationship, while so exciting, I realized in hindsight also had its roots in a lot of loss. Her husband's suicide, my losing my identity as a straight person, losing my long friendship with my ex-husband. In hindsight, perhaps Diane and I's relationship was going to be almost impossible to sustain. When she left me 3 years later, a couple of months after 9/11, I entered a difficult time. I was 47. I was alone, no children, 2 dogs. My consulting work had temporarily evaporated due to the tech bubble bursting after 9/11. I was lonely and felt like a failure. And I will say, and I can't really say this enough, First Unitarian became a real place of salvation for me. At the time, I was piloting the high school OWL class. I know a lot of you would remember Abby Chodoff. When I told her that my relationship was ending, she immediately in the middle of the class said, "You can come live with us. We have a spare bedroom." And I didn't do that, but her offer really touched me. Other church people reached out, checked in on me. I had been such a proud, invincible type. And I clearly remember feeling I have a choice here. I can stay kind of bitter and scared about where my life was, or I could have a little humble pie and recognize I'm as vulnerable as everybody else. So the church really, really helped me. And it felt like another time of grace in my life. So I dove in on church stuff. I was on the decor committee. Some of you will remember that experience. I was on ministerial relations committees. I went to every GA because you never know who you might meet. I was on the search committee, and some of you are here today, and that was still to this day really the most amazing committee I was ever on. I helped, along with Libby, start the first Wellspring group. Church was just my home. So at age, as a bisexual, I had an interesting decision to make at age 47. Did I want to date men or women or either? And I realized that at this time in my life, I wanted to be with a woman. So I did not pursue straight relationships. Internet dating was new. And I must say, I dove in and I got to know every Starbucks in Monroe County as I would diligently was trying to meet new people. You know, all that effort in the end, Maggie found me, which I still laugh about. So I met Maggie 5 years later, and it's kind of cliched to say this, but it was at the local gay pride parade. It was shortly after, this is going to feel like ancient history, but it wasn't very long ago. New York State's highest court had ruled that same-sex marriages were not a right because homosexual relationships were transient. So at the parade, we all from First Unitarian wore little signs. It was a piece of paper that said how long you'd been in relationship with your partner to disprove this theory on the high court's position. So I was single, so I wrote "still looking" on my sign. And Maggie came up to me at the end of the parade, which she was watching, and asked if I meant my sign. So the rest is history. We started dating, that was 2006, and we married the next year in Massachusetts because that was the only state it was legal. We had a blessing ceremony and reception back here in Rochester 2 weeks later. My mom was so pleased. She suggested we have a reception at Oak Hill Country Club. So it turns out we're sure they're first, and for all we know, only so far, same-sex wedding reception. So it was wonderful. Maggie moved from Geneva and graciously commuted to her professor job at New York Chiropractic College for the next 12 years until she retired. So we've been married 14 years at this point. Being gay had its difficulties in my extended conservative Christian family. When Maggie and I married, all 7 of her siblings, she's Irish Catholic family too, flew to town. One brother of mine didn't even RSVP. 2 brothers-in-law refused to come. Adult nieces and their children didn't come, despite my mom's efforts. The sister I'm closest to that I've preached about, she and I ran gay Christian dialogue circles together, struggled a lot, but finally came. So Maggie and I figured out something really important, that we were going to live completely openly, but loving towards all of them, despite their views. And while technically they might say they disagree with same-sex marriage, we're totally engaged with my extended family and totally accepted by them. That adult niece that wouldn't come to our wedding, her son mows our lawn. They have us to Thanksgiving dinner. Maggie, as a former nurse, was instrumental in my mother's care in helping us think through various decisions. So the lesson for me is that be loving and don't worry too much about people's stated beliefs. Look at their behaviors. In other words, take the high road. And there's a saying among gays, I hereby give you back your shame when you decide you're going to live openly like we have. Gonna zip along here for you all. So beyond family, I've had to come to terms with losing straight privilege, which, having lived a straight life for a long time, I had this interesting contrast. One doesn't come out once. If I go to the tailor to get my slacks shortened, I have to weigh whether I say to the tailor, my wife is going to pick them up, or just something vague like someone else will pick them up. Do I really want to come out to the tailor? As a leadership and communications trainer, I've always found you need a lot of personal stories to make a point. I had to rework dozens of stories because I didn't want to come out right away and become the focus of whatever leadership point I was trying to make. Even right now, our little therapy dog, Timmy, and I have worked with a little girl in the East Rochester schools for 3 years who, from what I can tell, comes from a very conservative family. We're meeting on Zoom this year. She's not asked me if I'm married, and I'm not sure what I'm going to say if she does ask me, because would I risk losing our 3-year relationship? So this whole question of when do I take a stand and when do I simply move on? It's an issue for all LGBTQ people, and there's certainly no easy answers. And I can't not get close to the end here and say a word about dogs. I love my dogs, and all of you who know me know I love my dogs. I got my first one at age 35. I counted them up. I've had 7. You want to come back in your next life as one of our dogs. I spend hours in the woods, walking the neighborhood, and now doing therapy dog work. So they've been part of my most enduring spiritual practices. So just quickly back to church and spirituality. Wellspring had taken off, and thanks to Tina Simpson, several of us then went to seminary. I was ordained in 2011, and 2 years later was certified as a spiritual director. And I've stopped doing my corporate work because of the pandemic, but I've continued this one-on-one work with Unitarians as they explore their spiritual selves. And this has become a wonderful chapter in my life. I work with Unitarians all over the country, thanks to Zoom. Elder care was a 20-year chapter for me, from roughly 2000 to 2020. My dad had dementia and needed round-the-clock care, and I really helped my mom manage the money and the finances, the medical care. I really feel that Wellspring and belonging to First Unitarian really helped me practice this spiritual opportunity of holding a very opinionated extended family together, which my parents would have wanted. And it's, again, I'll be really grateful. Will always be grateful to First Unitarian for that. I even ran, Sue Ames and I ran these Death Over Deli workshops, which came out of this extended elder care work that I went through with my own parents. So kind of this most recent chapter for me has come out of a continued lifelong suffering of some anxiety, maybe due to my childhood roots. And I ended up getting involved with a meditation practice in 2013 to help calm some of this vigilance that I experienced. And when I sought out the founder of this practice that I was exposed to, the only training I could do is to become a teacher of it. And so, to make a long story short, 8 years later, I'm now a certified meditation teacher and teach 2 classes at the church, as well as practice it myself. So it's funny that in the interweaving of life themes, this coming back to being a teacher over and over again is even happening right now in my life. So teaching, taking risks, accepting all this grace, finding a spiritual home at First Unitarian and in the pine trees. So thank you for listening to my story, because it's been so helpful to me to even come back and revisit some of these important themes in my life. So thank you all very much for listening.
to unmute myself. I have lived enough of this life with you to be so grateful, Joy. But I'm going to open it up for questions for, because I know other people. I'm going to take the spotlight off you. So that